The smell of burnt fat and heavy incense collided in the hallway, thick enough to choke the breath from Fiona's lungs. Through the blue haze of the kitchen, she watched her mother-in-law lean over 6-year-old Sean, whispering into his ear while sliding a heavy, silver-linked rosary into his small hand. The boy didn't look up at his mother. He stared at the grease congealing on his plate with a hollow, hunted expression Fiona had never seen before. On the table lay a single, handwritten note on the Board of Education's official stationery. An anonymous complaint that threatened to strip Fiona of everything she had built. When Fiona reached for her son, Sean didn't move toward her. He flinched, retreating into the shadow of Margaret's black dress. The older woman didn't utter a word. She simply tightened her grip on the boy's shoulder and offered a thin, triumphant smile that didn't reach her granite-cold eyes. Behind them, in the corner of the room, Fiona's husband sat in total silence, slowly pulling on a pair of heavy, noise-canceling headphones to drown out his wife's voice. The click of the kitchen door locking from the outside echoed like a gavel, signaling that the house was no longer a home, but a trap. Fiona O'Leary opened her eyes and immediately felt the sticky humidity of South Boston pinning her to the sheets. The air in the bedroom remained a stagnant jelly, saturated with the scent of stale powder and mothballs oozing from the cracks beneath the door. Fiona shifted her gaze toward the heavy velvet curtains Margaret had hung last week without asking. The dense fabric completely blocked the morning light, transforming the room into a suffocating vault. Fiona took a deep breath, but instead of freshness, she tasted only dust on her tongue. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she heard the authoritative click of Margaret's heels in the hallway, marking the boundaries of occupied territory. Fiona pushed the kitchen door open and froze at the sharp hiss of rendering fat. Margaret stood at the stove, shrouded in blue smoke, deftly snagging succulent, grease-dripping strips of bacon with a fork. Sean sat at the table, watching with wide-eyed fascination as golden grease splattered onto the clean tablecloth. With a triumphant smile, Margaret heaped a mountain of fried meat directly in front of the boy, ignoring the container of oatmeal and blueberries Fiona had prepared. The smell of char stung Fiona's eyes, and the sight of Sean greedily biting into the salty crust made her stomach churn. Margaret pointedly slid the salt shaker toward her grandson, casting a defiant look directly into Fiona's eyes. Fiona stepped forward, gripping the back of a chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her voice trembled as she reminded Margaret of the doctor's strict ban on fatty foods for Sean. Margaret didn't even turn around, continuing to pour maple syrup onto the boy's plate as if Fiona were merely the annoying static of radio interference. Margaret leaned toward Sean and whispered loudly that real Irish men needed strength, not empty grass. Fiona saw Sean drop his head, struggling to avoid his mother's gaze. Margaret took a towel and slowly wiped her hands, every movement broadcasting total contempt for Fiona's authority. Fiona flung open the door to her bedroom and stood paralyzed by a sharp, cloying scent of incense. Clouds of blue smoke drifted slowly beneath the ceiling, stinging the lining of her nose. She saw her pedagogy books shoved off the shelf, replaced by darkened icons in heavy frames. Fiona's personal photographs on the dresser now lay face down, while a silver censer smoked in their place. She rushed to the window, but the frame remained jammed, as if Margaret had intentionally sealed the room. Fiona's fingers shook as she touched the foreign rosary Margaret had left directly on Fiona's pillow, a sign of unspoken consecration and seizure. Fiona parked the car at the school gates, clutching the steering wheel and trying to steady her breathing. In her office, she laid out bright cards for an inclusive lesson, hoping work would serve as a sanctuary from the domestic chaos. Fiona sorted through lesson plans detailing support methods for children with special needs, feeling a fleeting surge of control over reality. The sound of the school bell resonated in her chest, forcing her to square her shoulders. She straightened her jacket and took a sip of cold coffee. trying to purge the image of Margaret's face. However, the slight tremor in Fiona's hands betrayed an internal tension that refused to vanish even within the familiar school walls. Fiona turned the key in the lock cautiously, trying not to disturb the heavy silence of the foyer. A muffled hiss, like the sound of escaping steam, drifted from the living room. Fiona froze by the doorframe, pressing her shoulder blades into the cold wallpaper. Margaret's voice sounded unnaturally soft, insidious, seeping through the gloom. Margaret whispered to Sean about the wicked changes Fiona had brought into the house along with her books, and how his mother dreamed of tearing them from the warm nest of their ancestors. Fiona heard Margaret call her an outsider, a destroyer of sanctities, and felt icy sweat trickle down her spine. Margaret's words settled into the child's mind like poisonous seeds. Fiona stepped sharply into the circle of light, and the floorboard beneath her shoe let out a treacherous groan. Sean flinched, his shoulders instantly rising to his ears. Fiona reached out a hand toward her son, hoping for the familiar warmth, but Sean shrank back fearfully into Margaret's soft side. In the boy's eyes sat a wariness Fiona had previously seen only in hunted animals. Margaret possessively placed a dry palm on the back of Sean's head, pulling him closer to her black dress. Fiona saw Sean's fingers frantically clutch the hem of Margaret's skirt. Between Fiona and her son, an invisible wall of barbed wire seemed to grow, erected by the mother-in-law's icy stare. Fiona walked onto the porch where the morning fog still clung to the railings. A government envelope with the Board of Education crest showed white in the mailbox. Fiona tore it open with shaking fingers, ripping the paper along a jagged edge. Lines about an unscheduled inspection and an anonymous complaint blurred before Fiona's eyes. The text bristled with accusations of promoting alien values and undermining moral foundations. Fiona felt a metallic taste of blood. She had bitten her lip too hard. Her gaze fell on the second-floor window, where Margaret's triumphant silhouette flickered behind the curtain. Every word in the letter seemed an echo of the mother-in-law's kitchen lectures, now granted legal force. Fiona knelt in the nursery, peering into the dark gap under Sean's bed in search of a lost sock. Instead of clothing, her fingers struck a stack of cheap, coarse paper. Fiona pulled out a bundle of brochures with screaming headlines about divine punishment and purification by fire. The covers depicted faces distorted by agony and harsh crosses. Fiona flipped through pages smelling of cheap printer ink and basement dampness, recognizing the symbols of a radical community on the outskirts of town. Rage burned Fiona's throat as she realized Margaret had secretly taken Sean to this den of madness. Fiona crumpled the leaflets, feeling their sharp edges slice the skin of her palms. Fiona burst into Declan's office, where the air smelled of stale tobacco and dust. Declan sat in his chair, staring at the monitor with an absent expression. Fiona began to speak, her voice breaking into a cry as she listed Margaret's threats and the horror from under Sean's bed. Declan didn't even turn his head. His jaws remained clamped shut. With the sluggishness of a mannequin, Declan reached into a drawer for a pair of massive headphones and pulled them on, completely cutting off the sound of Fiona's voice. Fiona grabbed Declan by the shoulder, but her husband roughly shook off her hand and walked out of the room, closing the door firmly behind him. The deafening silence struck Fiona harder than any slap. Fiona pushed the heavy oak door of the old church, and the smell of soot and unwashed bodies hit her face. Deep in the hall, under the dim light of flickering candles, Fiona saw Sean kneeling on the cold stone. A priest in a greasy cassock loomed over the boy, swinging a censer so violently the chains clanked in the silence. The priest shouted curses, demanding the expulsion of sinful thoughts planted by his mother. Fiona saw Sean trembling all over, eyes squeezed shut in terror. Margaret stood behind the priest, arms folded across her chest with the look of an inquisitor. Fiona felt horror give way to a primal rage, driving her forward. Fiona rushed toward the altar, shouting Sean's name, but a wall of gray coats and black headscarves blocked her path. The parishioners closed ranks, their shoulders becoming a monolithic barrier. Fiona tried to break through, but clawing fingers dug into her forearms, shoving her back. A roar of shouts about harlots and possessed women filled Fiona's ears. Faces distorted by malice surrounded her, stripping away the space to breathe. Fiona saw Sean through gaps in the crowd, but a broad back closed the view again. The air in the temple felt like molten lead pouring into Fiona's lungs as she struggled within the ring of foreign hands. Margaret stepped slowly from the shadows of the altar, and the crowd instantly fell silent, parting before her. Margaret's face appeared carved from gray granite. No warmth remained in her eyes. Margaret raised a hand, pointing at Fiona with a long, gnarled finger. Margaret's voice echoed under the church vaults, declaring that Fiona had finally lost her mind due to her pride. Margaret called upon the community to pray for the miserable, mentally ill woman who knew not what she did. Fiona saw the parishioners begin to cross themselves, looking at her with pity and disgust. Margaret stood over Sean like a black bird, finally claiming the right to his soul and will. Fiona ran into the house, gasping for air, and tripped over an empty coat rack in the hallway. A ringing, unnatural emptiness reigned in the house, making her ears pop. Fiona threw open the door to Sean's room and froze on the threshold. The shelves stood bare, the bed was made with a strange gray bedspread, the toys had vanished. Not a single car, not a single pencil. Margaret had purged the space with surgical precision. On the kitchen table, amidst perfect cleanliness, lay a lone sheet of paper. Fiona saw Margaret's calligraphic handwriting tracing a scripture quote about cutting off rotten branches. Fiona pressed her palms to her face, inhaling only the scent of bleach and a foreign, triumphant odor. Fiona frantically dialed Declan's number, pressing the receiver to her ear so hard the plastic bit into her skin. After long rings, Declan's voice sounded dry and detached, as if he were reading a report. Declan informed Fiona that he fully supported his mother's decision and considered Sean's isolation the only way to save the boy's psyche. Fiona screamed into the phone, begging Declan to come to his senses, but he coldly interrupted her, calling Fiona's actions unstable. Declan said Sean was safe, where modern contagion couldn't reach him. The short beeps in the receiver struck Fiona's eardrums, leaving her in absolute loneliness in the middle of a gutted house. Fiona entered the staff room, where three strangers in sharp suits already sat at the long table. The commission chairman silently pushed a stack of printouts toward Fiona. Fiona recognized her personal letters, diary drafts, and intimate correspondences that had been stored in a password-protected folder on the home computer. Every word was underlined in red marker, framing Fiona's doubts and reflections as proof of her professional incompetence. Fiona realized Margaret had hacked her life, turning her most private thoughts inside out. The stares of her colleagues, full of cold condemnation, burned Fiona's skin. The school walls, once her fortress, now seemed like stage sets for a trial where the verdict had already been delivered. Fiona sank to the floor in the middle of the ransacked nursery, where a forgotten scrap of Sean's drawing peeked from under the baseboard. Around Fiona lay torn curtains and empty boxes, resembling open wounds. Fiona ran her hand over the cold parquet, realizing the scale of the destruction. Margaret had scorched everything in her path. Fiona no longer held the keys to the school, had no voice in her own home, and, most terrifyingly, had no access to her son. The silence in the house became tangible, pressing on Fiona's shoulders, forcing her to curl into a ball. Fiona looked at her empty hands, understanding that Margaret had methodically and professionally erased her identity. Fiona pushed the double doors of the dining room, and the thick smell of roast lamb and heavy cologne hit her. At the massive oak table, beneath the crystal chandelier, figures in dark suits had already frozen into place. Margaret sat at the head of the table, shoulders squared like a queen on a throne. To Margaret's right, Fiona recognized Judge Kavanaugh. His bushy eyebrows met at the bridge of his nose, and his heavy gaze pinned Fiona to the threshold. Influential O'Leary cousins whispered, clinking silver utensils against fine china. The atmosphere in the room breathed with a solemn cruelty, turning an ordinary dinner into a tribunal hearing where the defendant's seat had already been prepared. Margaret slowly raised a dry hand, pointing a long finger toward the very corner of the room. There, by the kitchen entrance, a rickety stool sat forlornly, clashing with a set of carved chairs. Margaret didn't utter a word, but her pursed lips and the cold glint in her eyes made Fiona feel like an uninvited guest. The guests fell silent, watching as Fiona was forced to pick her way past their backs to this humiliating spot. The entire formal service and family silver were concentrated around Margaret, while before Fiona lay only bare wood. Margaret pointedly adjusted her napkin, stripping Fiona of the last remnants of her rights as mistress of the house. Margaret waited until the maid filled the glasses with thick red wine, then stood, leaning her palms against the edge of the table. Margaret's voice rang out loudly and mercilessly, cutting through the clatter of dishes. Margaret announced that Fiona was exhausted by a spiritual ailment and required long-term isolation from worldly cares. Those present nodded with feigned sympathy, while Margaret hammered out words about Fiona's indefinite leave of absence. Sean jerked his shoulder fearfully, as Margaret added that from now on, the heir's upbringing fell exclusively on her shoulders. Fiona felt the air in her lungs turn to barbed wire as the guests raised their glasses to the unfortunate woman's health, effectively erasing Fiona from her son's life. Margaret pulled a massive rosary from a black velvet box, its amber beads glowing dimly in the gloom. The heavy silver cross struck the edge of the table with a screech as Margaret looped the chain over Sean's head. The boy pulled his head into his shoulders, feeling the cold metal on his skin. Margaret tightened the beads so much they lay atop Sean's shirt collar like a sacred yoke. The guests erupted in an approving murmur, and Margaret solemnly proclaimed that this symbol of faith would shield Sean from the filth Fiona had tried to poison his young mind with. The amber grains dug into Sean's thin neck, marking the beginning of his new, controlled life. Margaret pulled a thick envelope with an embossed crest from under a napkin and placed it before Fiona with a dry click. On the paper, the name of St. Ignatius Academy was printed in bold, a closed boarding school known for its solitary cells and stick discipline. Fiona saw the enrollment date, tomorrow morning. Margaret triumphantly tapped her fingernail against the clause regarding a total ban on visits during the first year of study. The sheet of paper smelled of old leather and church wax, becoming for Fiona a warrant for separation. Margaret stared directly at Fiona, relishing how the color drained from her daughter-in-law's face at the sight of this documentary proof of child theft. Liam, Declan's cousin, noisily pushed his plate away and wiped his greasy lips with a napkin. His voice, hoarse from whiskey, filled the dining room with rants about blood purity and O'Leary traditions. Liam pointed a fork toward Fiona, calling her the weak link, whose liberal nonsense had nearly turned Sean into a spineless creature. The other men at the table grunted in agreement, discussing how timely Margaret had taken the reins. Fiona saw Liam curl his mouth in a contemptuous sneer, framing her beliefs as a dangerous infection. Every word Liam spoke was driven into Fiona's consciousness like a nail, finally turning her into an outcast in her own family. Fiona turned her head toward Declan, hoping to see even a drop of former warmth or protest in his eyes. Declan sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the bubbles in his champagne glass. When Fiona quietly spoke his name, Declan abruptly turned away to Judge Kavanaugh, striking up a loud conversation about an upcoming hunt. Fiona saw Declan's hand reach for his glass, and he clinked it with the judge's with a dry ring, sealing the unspoken pact of betrayal. The man Fiona loved now seemed a strange mannequin, completely subservient to Margaret's will. Declan's deafening ignore stripped Fiona of her last foothold in this hostile circle. Aunt Bridget, sitting across from Fiona, suddenly leaned forward, her face twisting into a mask of righteous anger. One by one, the female relatives began to pour accumulated gall onto Fiona, accusing her of neglecting Irish roots and disrespecting the memory of ancestors. Words about incompetence and pride rained down on Fiona, forcing her to shrink on the uncomfortable stool. Someone remembered Fiona's refusal to baptize Sean in the family church. Someone else mentioned her books. Fiona felt surrounded by a flock of crows, methodically pecking out her right to be called a mother. Margaret sat at the center of this vortex of accusations, maintaining the icy, approving calm of a conductor. Margaret stood and slowly circled the table, until her heavy silk skirt brushed Fiona's knees. The mother-in-law leaned so low, Fiona smelled the cloying scent of mint drops and ingrained malice. Margaret whispered directly into Fiona's ear that her suitcases had already been moved to the damp basement, near the back door. Every word from Margaret burned with cold. She informed her that the lock on the front door would be changed immediately after the guests left. Margaret hinted that Fiona's stay in this house was measured in minutes, and her expulsion was a settled matter. Fiona saw a triumphant spark in Margaret's eyes, already celebrating a complete and final victory. Sean couldn't withstand the pressure. His shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. Tears left wet tracks on his cheeks as he reached out trembling hands to Fiona, seeking protection from the monsters surrounding him. However, Margaret instantly intercepted the boy's wrists with her steel fingers, squeezing them painfully. Margaret forced Sean to fold his palms in a prayerful gesture, pressing them against the amber rosary. In a sharp, dry voice, Margaret ordered her grandson to recite the Lord's Prayer, drowning out his sobs. Fiona saw the terror in her son's eyes, but couldn't move, as if paralyzed by the poisonous gaze of her mother-in-law, who was turning prayer into an instrument of torture. Judge Kavanaugh exchanged a short chuckle with Liam, nodding toward Fiona's trembling hands. A surge of muffled laughter and mocking comments about the fragile psyche of city teachers filled the dining room. The guests began discussing Fiona's condition in the third person, as if she weren't in the room at all, savoring details of her allegedly progressing madness. Fiona heard someone call her a poor, unstable soul who belonged in a quiet retreat under the care of orderlies. These knowing smirks and condescending looks wounded deeper than direct insults, stripping Fiona of human dignity and turning her into an object of ridicule right before Sean's eyes. Inside Fiona, something snapped with a dry crack, and in place of fear, an icy, blinding rage flooded through her. She slowly, vertebra by vertebra, straightened her back, and the gesture forced the nearest guests to fall silent. Fiona's fingers dug into the edge of the starched tablecloth. Her knuckles turned blue-white, and her nails left deep furrows in the expensive fabric. Fiona raised her gaze and looked directly into Margaret's pupils, no longer looking away. In that look, there was neither plea nor despair, only a cold promise of war. The silence became so thick, the only sound was Sean's heavy, ragged breathing. Fiona began to stand, and this simple act of movement seemed the start of a devastating landslide. Fiona rose slowly from the rickety stool, and the sound of wood scraping against the parquet sliced the dining room silence like a gunshot. Fiona reached into her jacket's inner pocket and pulled out a bulky folder wrapped in gray technical paper. With a sharp swing, Fiona slammed the documents onto the center of the holiday table, right between the silver tureen and Judge Kavanaugh's plate. Splatters of greasy sauce flew in all directions, staining the snow-white tablecloth and the sleeves of suit jackets. The heavy folder landed with a dull thud, making the crystal glasses chime piteously. Fiona did not take her icy gaze off Margaret's widened pupils as the dust from old archival records slowly settled on the exquisite dishes. Fiona jabbed a finger at the top sheet of the document, where the city registrar's seal glowed in blue ink. Fiona's voice sounded low and firm as she read out dry legal terms confirming the ownership rights to this South Boston house. The paper rustled under Fiona's palm, revealing the truth that Declan and Fiona had been the sole legal owners of the property for the last 5 years. Fiona displayed the canceled power of attorney through which Margaret had managed the mansion, and every syllable struck the pride of those present like a hammer. Margaret's face turned from gray to earthy as Fiona underlined the clause regarding illegal residence with her fingernail. The relatives froze, staring at the yellowed pages that turned their queen into an ordinary squatter. Fiona turned the page, exposing bank transaction printouts with long columns of figures. Fiona pointed to the red highlighted lines, demonstrating to the guests how family savings intended for Sean's education had leaked into anonymous accounts of a radical community. The scent of printer ink mingled with the aroma of cooling roast as Fiona listed the dates and amounts Margaret had stolen from the common budget. Judge Kavanaugh leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, and his eyebrows shot up at the sight of a priest's offshore fund seal. Fiona saw Margaret frantically clutch the edge of the table as the scheme of systematic deception was laid bare. Every sheet Fiona turned ripped another brick from the foundation of the false piety Margaret had built for decades. Margaret lunged forward, her bony fingers curling in an attempt to grab the exposing papers. Fiona reacted instantly. She intercepted her mother-in-law's dry wrist mid-air and forcefully pinned Margaret's palm to the oak surface of the table. Margaret's skin felt parchment-like and cold to Fiona, but she did not loosen her grip. Fiona demanded silence with a short, commanding order that made Liam choke on his wine. Margaret hissed, trying to break free, but Fiona loomed over her like a thundercloud, blocking any movement. In this physical struggle, Fiona felt her superiority, seeing the primal rage in Margaret's eyes replaced by a panicked realization of loss. The silence in the room became absolute, broken only by Declan's heavy breathing. Fiona turned to Declan, ignoring Margaret's attempts to speak. Fiona hammered out the words of an ultimatum, looking her husband straight in the eye. Either Declan cleared the house of this crowd right now and recognized Fiona's authority, or she would call the police. Fiona pointedly pulled out her mobile phone, her thumb hovering over the call button. Fiona listed the charges: fraud, child abduction, and illegal withholding of property. The air in the dining room felt electrified as Fiona gave Declan 10 seconds to make a decision. Margaret tried to interject, but Fiona only squeezed her hand harder, not taking her eyes off Declan. Life in the old house froze in anticipation of the verdict that would forever change the O'Leary family hierarchy. Declan blinked fearfully, shifting his gaze from the stack of documents to Margaret's face, contorted with rage. Fiona saw sweat break out on Declan's forehead as he realized the scale of his mother's betrayal. With a heavy sigh, Declan pushed his chair back, and the sound of the legs on the floor sounded like the final breaking of chains. Declan slowly circled the table and stood shoulder to shoulder with Fiona, for the first time in years choosing his wife's side. Fiona felt the warmth of his shoulder, and it gave her strength. Declan placed a hand on the folder of documents, confirming their shared authority over this space. Margaret gasped as if struck in the stomach, seeing her only son voluntarily cross into the enemy camp. Fiona stepped toward Sean and, with one sharp movement, ripped the amber rosary from his neck. The clasp snapped with a quiet crunch, and Fiona felt the tension leave her son's shoulders. Without looking, Fiona threw the beads into the plate of unfinished greasy roast. The amber beads splashed into the brown gravy. Sean took a deep, shuddering breath, as if water had been pumped out of his lungs. Fiona saw a red mark from the heavy cross appear on the boy's pale skin, and gently ran her fingers over it. The rosary, the symbol of Margaret's power, now floated in meat fat, turned into a useless trinket. Fiona pulled Sean to her, feeling his small heart begin to beat more evenly. Margaret, deprived of her last lever of influence, sank heavily into her chair, her figure suddenly appearing diminished. The guests, sensing the shift in power, began to make their exits, leaving the dining room in a flurry of hushed whispers and avoided eye contact. Fiona stood her ground, watching the remnants of Margaret's regime crumble before her. As the last of the relatives filed out, a new silence filled the room, one not of oppression, but of a hard-won peace. Fiona knew the road ahead would be difficult, but as she looked at Declan and held Sean close, she knew she had finally reclaimed her home and her life.